Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. The farmers mark their property lines with little flags. Blue for this chemical, yellow for that one. But every once in a while, you'll be coming in low for a pass and you'll see it. A single tattered red flag tied to a cornstalk in the middle of an otherwise empty field. It's never on the work order. When you see that flag, you just pull up. You don't finish the pass. You don't spray the field. You fly straight back to the airstrip, land your plane, and call it a day. The farmer never says a word about it, and you never ask for payment. Some fields just need to be left alone. My name's Jake Hoffman, and I've been dusting crops out of Gibbon, Nebraska for 3 years now. It's not glamorous work. Hell, it's not even good work. But it pays the bills and keeps me in the air. After washing out of commercial aviation training and burning through my savings in Denver, this little operation run by Dwight Mueller seemed like a godsend. Dwight's family has been farming this stretch of Buffalo County since the 1890s, and his fleet of 3 Cessna ag trucks keeps half the county's soybeans and corn-fed and pest-free. The hangar sits on a gravel strip about 12 miles south of the Platte River, surrounded by section after section of farmland that stretches to every horizon. In summer, the heat shimmers off the runway like water, and the air smells of diesel fuel and herbicide. It's the kind of place you end up when you've run out of better options. Dwight explained the color-coded flag system on my first day. Blue flags marked fields getting 2.4D for broadleaf weeds. Yellow meant glyphosate for everything else. Green flags were for the organic farms, just water and biological controls. White flags meant the field was off limits due to wind conditions or proximity to water wells. "What about red flags?" I'd asked, scanning the laminated chart he'd handed me. Dwight's weathered face went still. He was replacing a fuel line on the Cessna, his thick fingers working the coupling with practiced ease. "Red flags mean you turn around. Don't ask questions. Don't radio for confirmation. Just turn around and come home." But what if Jake? He looked up from his work, his blue eyes serious. "There's rules out here that go back longer than my family's been farming this land. Some of them make sense. Some don't. But they all keep us safe. Red flag means no spray, no questions, no payment. That's the deal." I nodded, figuring it was just some old farmer superstition. Maybe insurance liability, or protected wetlands, or endangered species habitat. Rural communities are full of quirky traditions that seem strange to outsiders. That was before I learned what happens when you ignore the red flags. Before I discovered what lives in the fields that need to be left alone. Before I found out why Dwight's last pilot, Tommy Svoboda, drove his truck into the Platte River on a clear Tuesday morning in March, leaving behind a wife, 2 kids, and a note that said only, "The corn watches. The corn remembers." I should have asked more questions that first day. Should have pressed Dwight about those red flags. Should have wondered why he needed a new pilot so badly that he'd hire someone sight unseen from a Craigslist ad. But I didn't. And by the time I learned the truth, it was already too late to leave. My first week flying for Dwight went smoothly enough. The work was routine. Early morning takeoffs, low passes over endless rows of crops, the steady drone of the engine and the rhythmic spray of chemicals. The Cessna handled like a dream, responsive and stable, even in the thermal updrafts that rose from the sun-baked fields. Dwight's operation was small, but efficient. Besides me, there was Rita Kowalski, a mechanic who'd learned her trade in the Air Force, and Dwight's nephew, Caleb, a quiet kid fresh out of high school who helped with ground operations. Rita kept the flames running with an almost religious devotion, while Caleb loaded chemicals and updated flight logs with careful handwriting. "You settling in okay?" Rita asked on Thursday morning, wiping grease from her hands with a red shop rag. She was examining the oil filter on the middle Cessna, her practiced eye catching details I'd miss. "Yeah, it's good work," I said, checking the weather report on my phone. "High pressure system, light winds from the southeast, perfect flying conditions. Dwight's been fair to deal with." "He's good people," she agreed. "Lost a lot when Tommy." She trailed off, focusing intently on the filter housing. What happened to Tommy exactly? I'd been curious about this since my first day, but nobody seemed eager to discuss it. Rita's hands stilled. Tommy was troubled toward the end. Started seeing things that weren't there. Hearing voices in the radio static. Dwight tried to help him, but... She shrugged. "Some folks just can't handle the isolation out here. All that empty sky, all those empty fields. Gets to some people." Caleb walked over with the morning's flight plan, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Hoffman? Got your route ready. 8 fields today, mostly section roads 12 through 18. Standard herbicide mix." I studied the hand-drawn map. Simple enough, a grid pattern covering about 40 square miles of farmland. Each field was marked with its flag color and chemical requirements. All routine work. "Any red flags today?" I asked, only half joking. Caleb's face went blank. Rita looked up sharply from her work. "Not today." Dwight's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him walking from the office trailer, coffee mug in hand. "But Jake, you remember what I told you about those, right? Turn around and come home. No questions." "Good." He nodded approval. "Rita, how's number 2 looking?" The conversation shifted to engine maintenance, but I caught Caleb watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern? Mourning? He was 18, maybe 19, with the lean build of someone who'd grown up doing farm work. His family had been in Buffalo County even longer than Dwight's. The morning flights went without incident. I covered 6 fields in 3 hours, laying down precise strips of herbicide while staying well clear of any farmhouses, wells, or livestock. The summer heat was already building by 10 a.m., creating columns of rising air that made the Cessna bounce and dip. It was on the 7th field that I saw my first red flag. I was coming in for my initial pass over the Henderson place, an 80-acre section planted in soybeans, when I spotted it. A single strip of faded red cloth tied to a wooden stake driven into the ground at the field's center. Not tied to a cornstalk like Dwight had mentioned, this was soybeans, but clearly the same thing he'd described. My first instinct was to radio back to base for confirmation. The field was on my work order, marked for standard glyphosate treatment, but Dwight's words echoed in my memory. No questions, no radio calls. Just turn around. I pulled back on the stick, gaining altitude and banking away from the field. Below me, the soybeans stretched in perfect rows, looking healthy and weed-free. Whatever the red flag marked, it wasn't visible from the air. The flight back to the strip felt longer than usual. I kept checking my mirrors, though I couldn't say what I expected to see. The radio crackled with static, and for a moment I thought I heard something else underneath the white noise. A low sound like wind through grain, or maybe voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. "Must be interference from the power lines," I muttered, switching to a different frequency. The static cleared. I landed without incident and taxied to the hangar. Dwight was waiting near the fuel pump, shading his eyes against the sun. "How'd it go?" he asked as I shut down the engine. "Fine. 7 fields completed." I climbed out of the cockpit, my shirt already soaked with sweat from the heat and humidity. Had to skip the Henderson place. Red flag. Dwight nodded as if this was perfectly normal. Bill Henderson called this morning. Said he'd handle that field himself this year. Handle it how? It's not on my list for later visits. Some fields handle themselves, Jake. Best to leave it at that. He walked away before I could ask any more questions, leaving me standing beside the plane with a growing sense that I'd stumbled into something much stranger than simple agricultural work. That night, lying in my rented room above Custer's Bar in Gibbon, I couldn't shake the image of that red flag. It had looked old, weathered by seasons of wind and rain. And somehow, standing alone in that field of green soybeans, it had seemed less like a marker and more like a warning. The next morning brought thunderheads building on the western horizon, their anvil tops spreading like bruises against the pale sky. Rita emerged from the hangar, shaking her head. "Weather service says we got maybe 3 hours before this system hits," she announced, checking her phone. "Gonna be a quick day." Dwight handed me a truncated flight plan, just 4 fields, all clustered within a 10-mile radius of the airstrip. "Get these done and get back before the wind picks up," he said. "Don't want you fighting gusts in a loaded plane." The first 3 fields went smoothly. I worked fast, keeping one eye on the approaching storm. Lightning flickered inside the distant clouds, still too far away to hear thunder. The air felt heavy and electric, the way it does before Nebraska weather turns serious. The 4th field belonged to Frank Novak, a corn grower whose land bordered the Platte River bottoms. As I approached from the south, I could see his farmhouse and outbuildings nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. Neat rows of knee-high corn stretched across 80 acres, interrupted only by a gravel road that divided the field roughly in half. I was setting up for my first pass when I spotted the red flag. This one was different from the Henderson flag. Instead of being planted in the center of the field, it stood at the northeastern corner, tied to what looked like a fence post. But there was no fence, just the single post rising from the earth like a marker stone. Following protocol, I banked away and headed for home. But as I gained altitude, something made me look back at the Novak place. That's when I saw Frank himself, standing in his driveway beside a red Ford pickup, waving his arms over his head. He was signaling me to come back. I circled once, confused. The red flag clearly meant no spray, but the landowner was telling me to return. Maybe he'd planted the flag by mistake. Maybe it had blown there from somewhere else. Against my better judgment, I descended and waggled my wings to acknowledge him. Frank pointed toward the southern half of his field, the section separated from the red flag by the gravel road. His message seemed clear: spray the south half only. The corn in that section looked healthy but showed signs of cutworm damage along the edges. Nothing too serious, but definitely something that would benefit from treatment. I lined up for a pass, staying well south of the road and giving the red flag's area a wide berth. The first pass went fine. I laid down a clean strip of insecticide, then banked for the return run. But as I approached from the west, something caught my eye in the flagged section. The corn there was moving wrong, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't enough breeze for that. These stalks were bending and straightening in sequences, like waves rolling through green water, and the movement was too regular, too purposeful. It followed patterns that reminded me of breathing, or maybe something much larger walking through the rows. I completed my pass but kept watching the northern section. The movement had stopped, but now I could see gaps in the corn that I hadn't noticed before. Circular clearings, each about 20 feet across, scattered through the crop like footprints. By the time I finished treating the southern half, the storm was close enough to hear thunder rumbling across the prairie. I needed to get back to the strip, but curiosity made me circle the field one more time at a higher altitude. That's when I saw them clearly. 7 perfect circles where the corn had been flattened or removed entirely. They formed a pattern, not random, but arranged in a shape that almost looked like a constellation, or maybe a map. Lightning flashed, much closer now, and I felt the first turbulence as the storm's outflow whines reached me. Time to go. I turned east toward the airstrip, pushing the Cessna harder than I should have in the deteriorating weather. The radio crackled with static as I called in my approach. Through the interference, I could swear I heard something else. A low sound, like wind instruments. Or maybe voices singing in a language I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from below, rising from the fields themselves. I landed just as the first fat raindrops splattered on the windscreen. Rita and Caleb helped me push the plane into the hangar as the storm arrived in earnest, bringing horizontal rain and hail that drummed against the metal roof like machine gun fire. "Cut it close today," Rita shouted over the noise. "Yeah." I was still thinking about those circles in Frank's corn. "Hey, you ever notice anything strange about the Novak place?" Caleb looked up from securing tie-down straps. His face had gone pale. "What kind of strange?" Rita asked. "Just odd patterns in the crops, like something's been walking through there." The sound of rain on metal grew louder, drowning out conversation for a moment. When it quieted slightly, Caleb spoke in a voice barely loud enough to hear. "My grandfather used to say that land belonged to something else before the Novaks bought it. Before any of us came here, really." "Belonged to what?" I asked. "The people who were here first. The Pawnee, I think. Grandfather said there were sacred places all through this valley. Places where..." He trailed off, glancing toward Dwight's office. "Where what?" "Where the spirits lived. Where they still live, maybe. Places that aren't meant for farming or flying over or disturbing in any way." Rita frowned. "That's just old stories, Caleb." "Maybe. But Tommy used to talk about seeing things in those fields. Things that looked almost human, but moved wrong. And toward the end, he said they started following him home. A particularly loud crack of thunder made us all jump. Through the hangar's open door, I could see rain falling in sheets across the runway. Lightning lit up the sky every few seconds, turning the world harsh, white, and black. "Following him how?" I asked. Caleb glanced around nervously. He said he'd see them in his rearview mirror when he drove home at night, always staying just at the edge of his headlight beams, but keeping pace with his truck. And when he'd get to his house, he'd find corn silk on his porch. Fresh corn silk, even in winter. "That's enough," Dwight's voice cut through the conversation. He stood in the doorway to his office, arms crossed. No point scaring Jake with old wives' tales. "But Uncle Dwight..." "I said enough, Caleb." The boy nodded and went back to his work, but I caught him looking at me with something like pity. Or maybe fear. The storm passed after an hour, leaving the air cool and clean-smelling. We spent the rest of the afternoon doing maintenance, checking fuel lines and replacing worn parts. Normal work that helped push away thoughts of circles and cornfields and whatever might have made them. But that evening, driving back to my room in Gibbon, I kept checking my mirrors. The country roads were empty, lined with dripping corn and soybeans that seemed to press closer to the pavement than they had that morning. And when I parked behind Kuster's bar, I found something waiting on my truck's hood. A small pile of corn silk, still damp from the rain, arranged in a careful spiral like a calling card. Or a warning. The corn silk on my truck bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I swept it off with a gas station squeegee, but the spiral pattern stayed burned in my memory. Someone, or something, had taken the time to arrange those silken threads with care. I spent Friday morning researching the Novak property at the Gibbon Public Library, a cramped building that shared space with the city offices. The librarian, an elderly woman named Dorothy Carlson, helped me navigate the local history collection. Frank's grandfather bought that land in 1923, she explained, pulling a thick binder from the shelf. Paid cash, which was unusual for those times. The previous owner was eager to sell. The records were handwritten in faded ink. According to the deed transfer, the land had changed hands 6 times between 1870 and 1923, an unusually high turnover for prime agricultural ground. Why so many owners? I asked. Dorothy adjusted her glasses, studying the documents. Hard to say. Could have been financial troubles, family disputes, poor soil conditions. She paused. Though my grandmother used to tell stories about that area, said the Pawnee considered it sacred ground, a place where spirits walked between worlds. What kind of spirits? The kind that could take the shape of animals or people when they chose to. Grandmother called them the corn dancers, though I suspect that wasn't their real name. She said they lived in the spaces between the rows, protecting the land from those who would harm it. I photographed the relevant pages and thanked Dorothy for her help. As I left, she called after me. Jake? You're working for Dwight Mueller, aren't you? Yes, ma'am. Her expression grew serious. Be careful out there. Some old agreements are still in force, whether folks remember them or not. That afternoon brought perfect flying weather. Clear skies, light winds, and excellent visibility. My route included 8 fields scattered across the county. None of them flagged red according to the work order. I should have been relieved. The first 5 fields went smoothly. Standard herbicide applications, all routine work that kept my mind occupied. But as I approached the 6th field, another section of Frank Novak's property, this one planted in soybeans, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. No red flag this time, but the soybeans in the center of the field had been harvested in a perfect circle, about 50 feet across. The plants weren't cut. They were gone, leaving only bare earth, as if something had simply erased them from existence. I completed the spray run, but kept circling back to look at that bare patch. From 500 feet up, it looked like a giant had pressed a cookie cutter into the green field. The edges were too clean, too precise to be natural. On my way to the 7th field, I flew over the Henderson place where I had seen my first red flag. The soybeans there looked normal from altitude, but something made me descend for a closer look. The red flag was gone. In its place stood a scarecrow I was certain hadn't been there before. It wore faded overalls and a straw hat, arms spread wide in the classic pose. Nothing unusual about that. Half the farms in Nebraska used scarecrows, except this one was facing the wrong direction. Instead of facing outward to scare birds away from the crops, it faced inward toward the center of the field. And as I banked around for another pass, I could swear its head turned to follow my plane. My hands started sweating inside my gloves. Scarecrows don't move. They're just straw and old clothes on wooden frames, but this one seemed to track my flight path with deliberate attention. I climbed to a safer altitude and continued to the 7th field, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the movement. Thermal updrafts can create optical effects. Heat shimmer can make stationary objects appear to move. But when I glanced back at the Henderson place, the scarecrow had changed position entirely. It now stood at the field's edge, arms no longer spread, but hanging at its sides like a person waiting for something. The 7th field belonged to Walt Kerner, a widower who farmed the section next to the Platte River bottoms. Walt was known for keeping meticulous records and treating his land with scientific precision. His corn stood in perfect rows, each plant healthy and uniform. I was halfway through the first pass when I spotted them. 3 scarecrows stood in Walt's field, arranged in a triangular pattern. Like the Henderson scarecrow, these faced inward rather than outward. And they were moving. Not the subtle movement I might have imagined earlier, but obvious, deliberate motion. As I watched from 200 feet above, one of the figures raised its arm and pointed directly at my plane. I abandoned the spray run and climbed rapidly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The radio crackled to life, Dwight's voice cutting through the static. "Jake, you there?" Walt Kierner just called. "Says you buzzed his field but didn't finish the job." I keyed the mic with shaking fingers. "Dwight, there's something wrong with Walt's field. There are figures down there." Silence for several seconds. Then, "What kind of figures?" "Scarecrows. 3 of them. They were moving, Dwight. Pointing at me." More silence. When Dwight's voice returned, it sounded tired. "Come on home, Jake. We need to talk." The flight back to the strip felt endless. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me through the sky. The radio picked up fragments of conversation from other aircraft, crop dusters working calmies to the north and south, their voices calm and professional. Normal people doing normal work in a normal world. I envied them. Dwight was waiting beside the hangar when I landed, his face grim. Rita and Caleb stood nearby, their expressions equally serious. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Dwight said as I shut down the engine. I described the bare circle in Frank's soybeans, the moving scarecrow at the Henderson place, and the 3 figures in Walt's field. As I talked, Dwight's jaw grew tighter. "You didn't spray Walt's field at all?" "No, I pulled up as soon as I saw those things." Dwight nodded slowly. "Good. That probably saved your life." "What do you mean?" Rita stepped forward. "Jake, those weren't scarecrows you saw. Scarecrows don't move, don't point, don't track aircraft." "Then what were they?" Caleb spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yi Naldlushi. That's what my grandmother called them. Skinwalkers." The word sent ice through my veins, though I didn't fully understand why. "They're old," Dwight continued. "Older than the farms, older than the towns. They've been here since before any of us arrived, and they'll be here long after we're gone. But what do they want?" "To be left alone," Rita said. "The red flags mark their territory, the places they consider sacred. As long as we respect those boundaries, they mostly ignore us." "Mostly?" Dwight's expression darkened. Tommy didn't respect the boundaries. Toward the end, he started thinking he could outsmart them. Started carrying a rifle in his plane, talking about clearing out the competition. He'd spray the red-flagged fields anyway, claiming he didn't see the markers. What happened to him? "They gave him warnings first. Corn silk on his truck, like what you found yesterday. Then scarecrows started appearing in fields where they'd never been before. Always watching him, always pointing. Tommy laughed it off, said it was just farmers playing pranks. Caleb took up the story, but then he started seeing them away from the fields, standing in his yard at night, sitting in his truck when he came out of the grocery store, walking beside his car on dark roads." "They were learning from him," Rita added. "Studying how he moved, how he looked, how he spoke. That's what they do. They watch until they understand. And then what? Then they become you," Dwight finished. "They take your shape, your voice, your memories, and the real you disappears." I thought about the scarecrow that had pointed at my plane, about the deliberate way it had moved. Had it been learning from me too? The morning Tommy died, Dwight continued, his wife found him standing in their kitchen, making coffee like he did every day. Nothing seemed wrong at first, but when she looked closer, she noticed he was wearing yesterday's clothes, and his eyes. He shrugged. She said his eyes looked like someone else was looking out through them. She called me, scared out of her mind, Rita said. By the time I got there, Tommy was gone, but his wife swore the thing in her kitchen wasn't her husband, said it moved wrong, talked wrong, even breathed wrong. We found his truck in the river that afternoon, Dwight concluded, but some folks think what drove it there wasn't Tommy at all. Think it was something else wearing his face, cleaning up loose ends. The hangar fell quiet, except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind through the corn. I stared at the three faces surrounding me, looking for signs that this was some elaborate joke or hazing ritual for the new pilot. But their expressions held no humor, only the weight of shared knowledge and carefully guarded fear. So what happens now? I asked. Now you decide, Dwight said. You can pack up tonight and leave Nebraska behind. Find work somewhere else. Forget everything you've seen here. Or you can stay and learn to follow the rules. All of them, without exception. I looked out at the fields surrounding the airstrip. Acres of corn and soybeans stretching to every horizon. Somewhere out there, things that weren't quite human were watching, waiting, learning. And for the first time since arriving in Gibbon, I understood why Tommy Svoboda had driven his truck into the Platte River. Some secrets are too heavy to carry. I spent that night in my room above Coaster's bar, staring at the ceiling and listening to the jukebox downstairs cycle through the same 20 country songs. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to pack my bags and drive straight back to Denver. Find work at the airport, maybe instructing student pilots or flying cargo runs. Safe, normal aviation work, where the biggest worry was weather or mechanical failure. But I couldn't shake the image of those scarecrows pointing at my plane. The way they'd moved with such purpose, such awareness. Whatever lived in these fields had noticed me now, and something told me that running might only make things worse. Around 2 a.m, I made my decision. I'd stay, but I'd follow every rule Dwight gave me. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no curiosity-driven mistakes like Tommy had made. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with low clouds that promised another storm by afternoon. Dwight was already at the hangar when I arrived, drinking coffee from a thermos and studying weather reports on his phone. Figured you might have left town by now, he said without looking up. I'm staying. But I need to know all the rules, not just the red flag business. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Rita. Rita emerged from beneath the engine cowling of the middle Cessna, grease streaking her forearms. Yeah. Jake's staying. Time he learned the full protocol. She wiped her hands on a shop rag and walked over, her expression serious. You sure about this? Once you know everything, there's no pretending it's just superstition anymore. I'm sure. Rita exchanged a glance with Dwight, then began counting off on her fingers. Rule 1. Red flags mean no spray, no questions, no payment. You already know that one. Rule 2, Dwight continued. Never fly alone over the Platte River bottoms after sunset. They're more active in those areas when it gets dark. Rule 3. If you see scarecrows in a field that didn't have them before, don't complete that spray run. Land immediately and call it in. Rule 4, Rita added. If your radio picks up voices speaking in languages you don't recognize, switch frequencies and get back to base. Don't try to understand what they're saying. Rule 5. Never under any circumstances land in a field that isn't the designated airstrip, even for emergencies. Better to dead stick it into a road than set down in their territory. Caleb emerged from the office with a fresh pot of coffee and 3 work orders. Rule 6, he said quietly. If you find corn silk or other plant matter on your truck, don't touch it with your bare hands. Use gloves, dispose of it in the burn barrel, and wash your hands with this. He handed me a small bottle of what looked like salt water. What is it? Blessed water from Sacred Heart Church in Grand Island. Father Martinez knows about the situation out here. He makes sure we have a steady supply. There are more rules, Dwight said, but those are the main ones for flying. The others you'll learn as needed. The morning's work consisted of 3 fields, all routine herbicide applications on established farmland. I followed every protocol exactly, double-checking flag colors and maintaining safe altitudes. The clouds thickened as I worked, and by the time I finished the 3rd field, light rain had begun to fall. I was heading back to the strip when the radio crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize. Nebraska 278, this is Nebraska 278. That was my tail number. Someone was using my call sign. Nebraska 278, do you copy? The voice sounded like mine, but wrong somehow. Like a recording played back at slightly the wrong speed. I reached for the mic, then remembered Rule 4 and switched to a different frequency instead. The rain intensified as I approached the airstrip, fat drops spattering the windscreen and making the gravel runway slick. I radioed my approach on the correct frequency and landed without incident. But the false radio call had left me shaken. Everything okay? Rita asked as I taxied into the hangar. Someone was using my call sign on the radio. Sounded like... I paused, unsure how to explain it. Like me, but not quite right. Dwight and Rita exchanged the same look I'd seen before. Concern mixed with resignation. They're learning from you, Caleb said, from where he was fueling the other Cessna. Picking up your voice patterns, your radio procedures. Tommy went through the same thing. How long does it take? Depends, Dwight replied. With Tommy, it was about 3 weeks from first contact to when they really got his voice down perfect. Of course, he made it easy for them by ignoring the red flags. The rest of the morning was spent on maintenance and paperwork. Normal tasks that helped push away thoughts of something out there practicing my voice, learning to sound like me. But every time the radio crackled with static, I tensed. Around noon, Frank Novak stopped by the hangar. He was a thick-set man in his 60s, with weathered hands and the cautious demeanor of someone who'd lived with secrets for a long time. Dwight, we got a problem, he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Rita. Found more circles in my north section this morning. 7 of them now, arranged in some kind of pattern. Any crop damage? That's the strange part. The soybeans inside the circles are growing faster than the rest of the field. Plants are twice as tall as they should be, and the beans are already forming pods, like something's accelerating their growth. Dwight frowned. That's new. They've never done anything like that before. Gets worse, Frank continued. My neighbor, Ed Hrubeck, says his cattle won't go near the fence line that borders my property. All 100 head of them cluster in the far corner of his pasture. Won't even drink from the stock tank on that side. Animals know, Caleb said softly. They can sense things we can't. Frank nodded. My grandfather used to say the same thing. When the animals get spooked, it means the spirits are restless about something. What's changed? I asked. I mean, if they've been leaving your land alone for decades, why are they more active now? Frank's eyes settled on me with uncomfortable intensity. That's what I've been wondering too. Only thing different is, we got a new pilot. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Rita cleared her throat. Frank, You saying this is Jake's fault somehow? Not fault exactly, but maybe they're interested in him. Tommy, toward the end, he said they were studying him, learning from him. Maybe they're doing the same thing now. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I've followed every rule you've given me, haven't sprayed a single red-flagged field. I know that, Frank said. But rules or no rules, you've been flying over their territory for 2 weeks now. They've had time to notice you. Time to decide if you're a threat. Am I a threat? Frank's smile held no warmth. That depends on what they find when they look close enough. Tommy seemed harmless too at first. He finished his coffee and headed for the door, then paused. Jake, I don't know you well enough to give advice, but if I were you, I'd be real careful about what I did and where I went for the next few weeks. They're watching you now, learning from you, and once they think they understand you well enough. He shrugged. Well, Tommy's truck is still at the bottom of the Platte River. After Frank left, the hangar fell quiet, except for the drum of rain on the metal roof. I stared out at the gray afternoon, watching water cascade from the gutters and pool in the gravel parking area. He's trying to scare you, Rita said finally. Is it working? She considered this. Yeah, probably. But scared might keep you alive longer than confident. That evening, driving back to my room in town, I kept the radio off and checked my mirrors obsessively. The country roads were empty, fields of corn and soybeans pressing close on both sides. In the fading light, every scarecrow looked like it might be watching. Every movement in the crops might be something more than wind. When I parked behind Coaster's bar, I found another gift waiting on my truck. A small ear of corn, still in its husk, placed carefully on the hood. The kernels were deep red, a color I'd never seen on corn before. I used a shop rag to pick it up, remembering Caleb's warning about bare skin contact. But as I lifted it, the husk fell away to reveal that the kernels weren't kernels at all. They were tiny human teeth. The corn cob filled with human teeth sat in a mason jar on my nightstand, a reminder of just how far from normal my life had become. I'd wrapped it in plastic and sealed it away, but I could still smell something sweet and rotten emanating from the glass. Sleep came in fragments that night. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of standing in endless cornfields while shapes moved between the rows, always just out of sight. In the dreams, I could hear my own voice calling from somewhere in the green maze, pleading for help that never came. I woke at dawn feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. The mason jar sat where I'd left it, but now condensation clouded the glass, and something had traced symbols in the moisture, angular marks that looked almost like letters in a language I didn't recognize. My phone rang as I was getting dressed. Dwight's number. Jake, we got an emergency. Ed Rubeck's got a sick bull that needs treatment, and his regular spray contractor's equipment broke down. Says he'll pay double if we can get someone out there this morning. I knew Ed's property. It bordered Frank Novak's land, the same area where the mysterious circles had appeared. Is it flagged? No red flags, but... Dwight paused. It's close to some sensitive areas. You'll need to be extra careful about boundaries. An hour later, I was airborne with a load of antibiotic solution, flying toward the Rubeck Ranch. The morning was clear and still, perfect conditions for precise application. Ed's cattle were gathered in the northwest pasture, about 50 head of Black Angus clustered near a stock tank. From the air, I could see the problem immediately. One bull stood apart from the herd, moving in erratic circles near the fence line. Even from 500 feet up, I could tell something was wrong with its gait. I lined up for my first pass, focusing on the area around the sick animal. The solution would help fight off infection and reduce inflammation, buying time for a veterinarian to make a proper diagnosis. That's when I noticed the scarecrow. It stood in Frank Novak's adjoining cornfield, about 50 yards from the fence line. Unlike the ones I'd seen before, this figure wore modern clothes, jeans, a red flannel shirt, work boots, and it was facing me directly, arms raised as if signaling. I maintained my approach, following the flight plan Ed had approved. But as I descended toward the pasture, the scarecrow began moving. Not the subtle shifts I'd witnessed before, but obvious, deliberate motion. It walked along the fence line, keeping pace with my aircraft. The bull below was acting stranger now, spinning in tight circles and foaming at the mouth. Whatever was wrong with it was getting worse fast. I started my spray run, keeping one eye on the wandering bull and another on the walking scarecrow. The antibiotic solution flowed out in a controlled mist, covering the pasture grass where the cattle grazed. Halfway through the pass, my radio crackled to life. Nebraska 278, this is Ed Hrubeck. You need to abort your run and get out of there now. I keyed the mic. Ed, I'm only halfway finished. The bull needs... The scarecrow in Frank's field had stopped moving. It now stood directly below me, arms still raised, face turned upward. For the first time, I could see its features clearly. It looked like Tommy Svoboda. Same height, same build, same weathered baseball cap. But the face was wrong. Too smooth, too perfect. Like a photograph of Tommy rather than Tommy himself. And the eyes were completely white, without pupils or iris. Jake, get out of there now. Ed's voice again, this time tinged with panic. That thing in my pasture isn't my bull. I looked down at the sick animal. It had stopped circling and now stood motionless, staring up at my plane. Its eyes were white, just like the scarecrow's. As I watched, it opened its mouth and made a sound no bull should be able to make. A perfect imitation of a Cessna engine starting up. My hands were shaking as I pulled back on the stick, abandoning the spray run and climbing rapidly. The radio erupted with multiple voices, all claiming to be different people, all ordering me to do contradictory things. Land immediately. Continue the application. Return to base. Set down in the north pasture. I switched to the emergency frequency and called for help. Mayday, Mayday. This is Nebraska 278. I need immediate assistance. The response came in my own voice. Nebraska. 278. This is Jake Hoffman. Everything is fine. Return to the designated landing zone and await further instructions. I turned off the radio entirely and focused on flying. Below me, the landscape looked different than it had minutes before. Fields that should have been planted in corn showed only bare earth. Farmhouses I recognized were missing from their usual locations. Roads curved in directions they'd never curved before. The scarecrow that looked like Tommy was moving again, running through the cornfield at impossible speed, keeping pace with my aircraft. Other figures emerged from the crops, more scarecrows wearing the faces of people I'd never met, all of them pointing upward at my plane. I needed to get back to the airstrip. But nothing looked familiar anymore. The Platte River, which should have been visible to the north, was nowhere to be seen. The grain elevator in Gibbon, usually a landmark I could spot from miles away, had vanished. It was as if the entire landscape had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but the engine was running rough. The spray equipment was still releasing solution, even though I'd shut it off. The chemical smell in the cockpit was making me lightheaded. That's when I saw the runway. It appeared ahead of me like a mirage, a stretch of gravel in the middle of a cornfield. Not Dwight's airstrip. This one was longer, newer, with a hangar that looked like it had been built yesterday. 3 people stood beside the runway, waving me down. Dwight, Rita, and Caleb, all of them gesturing for me to land. But something was wrong with their movements. too synchronized, too perfect, like they'd rehearsed the scene. And their shadows fell in the wrong direction, as if the sun was shining from the north instead of the east. I banked away from the false runway and kept flying. The figures on the ground watched me go, their heads turning in unison to track my flight path. My real radio crackled back to life, Dwight's voice, but strained with worry. "Jake, where are you? Ed Hrubeck says you never showed up for the spray job." I keyed the mic with trembling fingers. "Dwight, I'm lost. The landscape, it's all wrong. Nothing looks the same." "Jake, listen to me carefully. Do you see any red flags below you?" I scanned the fields beneath my aircraft. There, a single red cloth tied to a fence post, fluttering in the breeze. Yes, one red flag, due south of my position. Good. That's real. Follow the fence line east from that flag. It'll lead you to County Road 18, then follow the road north. You'll see our strip in about 5 miles. Dwight, what's happening to me? They're testing you, Jake. Seeing how you react under pressure, how well you follow instructions when everything goes sideways. Tommy failed this same test. I found the fence line and followed it east, my hands steady on the controls despite the fear churning in my stomach. The landscape below began to look familiar again. The Platte River reappeared. The grain elevator materialized in the distance, roads curved back to their proper directions. The fake runway and its false figures vanished like smoke. 20 minutes later, I was on the ground at Dwight's strip, my legs shaking as I climbed out of the cockpit. Rita was waiting with a thermos of coffee spiked with something stronger. "You did good," she said, steadying me as I walked toward the hangar. "Tommy tried to land at their fake runway. That's when they really got their hooks into him." What would have happened if I'd landed there? Dwight emerged from the office, his face grim. "Best guess? They would have taken your plane, your equipment, maybe your identity, and the real Jake Hoffman would have joined Tommy at the bottom of the Platte River." Caleb was examining my aircraft, running his hands along the fuselage and wings. "Uncle Dwight, you need to see this." We gathered around the plane. Carved into the metal near the cockpit were the same angular symbols I'd seen traced in the condensation on my mason jar. They looked like they'd been etched with fingernails or claws, deep enough to score the aluminum. "Marking their territory," Rita observed, "or marking you as someone they're interested in. What does it mean?" Dwight studied the symbols for a long moment. "It means you passed their first test, Jake. But it also means there'll be more tests coming. They're not done with you yet." I thought about the scarecrow with Tommy's face, about the bull that had mimicked aircraft sounds, about the false runway that had appeared in the middle of nowhere. If that was their first test, what would the second one look like? How many tests did Tommy face? 3, Caleb said quietly. He failed the third one. As we pushed the plane into the hangar, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the soft earth near the runway, someone had left footprints leading from the landing area to the road. Human footprints, but too large, with toes that were too long and spread too wide. And they were filled with corn kernels, as if whoever had made them was bleeding grain instead of blood. The prints led toward town, toward Gibbon, toward the room where I slept each night above Custer's bar. They knew where I lived. That night, I moved out of my room above Custer's bar. The thought of those footprints leading straight to my door made sleep seem like a dangerous luxury. Instead, I spent $40 on a tent and sleeping bag at the Walmart in Grand Island and set up camp in the municipal park, figuring public spaces might offer some protection. I was wrong. Around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Slow, measured steps that crunched softly on the fallen leaves. I lay still, listening to the pattern. 7 steps clockwise, pause, 7 steps counterclockwise, pause, over and over like a ritual. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see a shadow moving around the tent's perimeter. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow, too tall and angular. When it passed in front of the streetlight, I noticed it cast 2 shadows, one following its movements, another that seemed to move independently. "Jake?" The voice was mine, but with a slight echo, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Jake, why are you hiding?" I held my breath, pressing my face against the sleeping bag. "I know you're awake, Jake. I can hear your heart beating." The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent's entrance. I could see the outline of someone crouching down, hands pressed against the fabric near my head. "We need to talk, Jake. About the rules. About what happens to pilots who don't follow them." I closed my eyes and tried to remember the prayers my grandmother had taught me as a child. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, anything that might offer protection against whatever was outside. "Tommy thought he was clever too," my voice continued from outside the tent. "Thought he could outwit us, outlast us. But Tommy forgot that we've been here much longer than humans have been flying over our fields." The hands moved against the tent wall, tracing patterns I couldn't see but could feel through the fabric. The same angular symbols that had been carved into my plane. "You did well today, Jake. Passed the first test. But there are more tests coming, and they get harder each time." I heard the sound of a zipper opening. Not my tent, something else. The sound was too long, too slow, like skin being peeled away from muscle. "Would you like to see what Tommy looks like now? Would you like to know what happens to pilots who failed a 3rd test?" Something wet dropped onto the tent roof directly above my head. Then another drop, and another. The smell hit me a moment later. Copper and decay, like roadkill left in the sun for days. He's still flying, Jake. Still taking jobs. Still working for farmers who need their crops dusted. But Tommy doesn't need sleep anymore. Doesn't need food. Doesn't need anything except the permission to keep wearing his face. The dripping stopped. The shadow outside the tent stood up, stretching to an impossible height before shrinking back to human proportions. "See you tomorrow, Jake. Bright and early. Dwight has a big job lined up for you." The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay in my sleeping bag until dawn, listening to every sound. The wind in the trees, cars passing on the street, the distant whistle of a freight train. Normal sounds from a normal world that felt increasingly far away. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my tent and drove back to the airstrip. Dwight was already there, examining a weather map spread across his office desk. "You look like hell," he observed as I walked in. "Didn't sleep much. Had visitors." He nodded as if this was expected. "They're escalating. First test is usually about flying skills. Can you handle unusual conditions? Stay calm under pressure? Second test is more personal." "What kind of personal?" "They'll try to get inside your head. Appear as people you know. Say things designed to make you doubt yourself. The goal is to make you break the rules on purpose, either out of anger or fear." Rita emerged from the hangar, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "Coffee's ready. You look like you need it." I accepted a mug of black coffee and let the heat warm my hands. "Dwight, what happened to the other pilots before Tommy? The ones who worked for you before him?" His face darkened. "There were 3 before Tommy. First one was Danny Krejci back in '98. Good pilot, careful with the rules. But he got curious about the red-flagged areas, started asking too many questions. One morning we found his plane in the middle of Frank Novak's cornfield, engine still running, cockpit empty. And the second one? Maria Santos. Lasted 2 years before she started seeing things. Claimed the corn was talking to her, giving her instructions. She'd come back from flights with stories about landing in fields that weren't on any map, meeting farmers who spoke in languages that didn't exist. What happened to her? Disappeared in 2003. Left her car at the Kearney airport with a note saying she'd found a better job. But her sister got Christmas cards from her for 3 years after that, all postmarked from different towns in Nebraska. Same handwriting, same signature, but the sisters swore something was off about them. Caleb walked in from the hangar, carrying a flight plan. "Uncle Dwight, we got a problem. The Kowalski farm called. They need emergency fungicide treatment. Early blight in their potatoes." "That's not a problem," Dwight said, scanning the paperwork. "Standard application, good weather." "It's not the job that's the problem," Caleb continued. "It's the location. The Kowalski farm borders the old Pawnee burial ground. You know, the one with all the red flags." Dwight's expression grew serious. "How close to the burial ground?" "About half a mile. But there's been some kind of disturbance there. Mrs. Kowalski says she's been finding strange circles in her potato field, and her irrigation system keeps breaking down. Water lines are getting clogged with what looks like corn silk and human hair." I set down my coffee mug. "Human hair?" "That's what she says. Long black hair that doesn't belong to anyone in her family. And it's always wet, even when there hasn't been rain for days." Rita frowned. "Sounds like they're trying to expand their territory, using the water system to spread their influence." "Could be," Dwight agreed. "Or it could be a test. Jake, this job specifically requested you. Mrs. Kowalski asked for the new pilot by name." "How would she know my name?" "That's what I'd like to know." I studied the flight plan. The Kowalski farm was 15 miles northwest of the airstrip, in an area I'd never flown before. The potato fields were laid out in a grid pattern with irrigation channels running between the rows. On paper, it looked like a straightforward application. "What's my gut telling me?" I asked. "Your gut should be telling you to stay away," Rita said, "but your paycheck needs you to take the job. And if it's a test, then refusing might be worse than accepting," Dwight admitted. "They don't like being ignored." I spent the next hour preparing for the flight. Rita helped me load fungicide into the spray tanks, while Caleb updated the weather charts. Standard preparations for a routine job, but nothing felt routine anymore. As I was conducting my pre-flight inspection, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Someone had placed a small bundle of corn husks under the port wing, tied together with what looked like human hair. The same long black strands Caleb had mentioned. "Rita, look at this." She examined the bundle without touching it. "Looks like some kind of offering, or maybe a warning." "Should I remove it?" "I wouldn't. Might be bad luck to disturb it." I completed my inspection and climbed into the cockpit. The engine started smoothly, and all the instruments showed normal readings. But as I taxied toward the runway, I noticed movement in the cornfield beyond the hangar. 3 scarecrows stood among the stalks, positioned to watch my takeoff. They wore the faces of the pilots who had worked for Dwight before me: Danny Krejci, Maria Santos, and Tommy Svoboda. All of them had their arms raised, pointing in the direction of the Kowalski farm. I completed my takeoff roll and climbed into the clear morning sky. The flight to the Kowalski farm took 20 minutes, following section roads and irrigation channels across the flat Nebraska landscape. Everything looked normal from altitude: neat rows of crops, scattered farmhouses, the occasional cattle pasture. But as I approached the Kowalski property, I noticed the first signs of trouble. The potato fields were the wrong color. a sickly yellow-green instead of the healthy green they should have been. And the irrigation channels were dark, as if the water flowing through them had been stained with something thick and black. Mrs. Kowalski was waiting in her farmyard, a small woman in her 70s wearing a faded house dress. She waved at my aircraft as I circled the field, but something about her movements seemed off. Too energetic for someone her age, too coordinated. I lined up for my first pass and began the fungicide application. The spray equipment worked perfectly, laying down an even coat of treatment across the affected rows. But as I banked for the return pass, I noticed that Mrs. Kowalski was no longer in her farmyard. She was standing in the middle of the potato field, directly in my spray path. And she was looking up at me with eyes that were completely white. I pulled up hard, cutting off the spray and climbing rapidly to avoid the figure standing in the potato field. Mrs. Kowalski, or whatever was wearing her appearance, didn't move as the Cessna passed overhead. She just stood there, arms at her sides, those white eyes tracking my aircraft. My radio crackled to life. "Jake, this is Dwight. Mrs. Kowalski just called. Says you're spraying the wrong field." I keep the mic, still circling above the farm. "Dwight, Mrs. Kowalski is standing in the middle of the field I'm supposed to spray, and something's wrong with her eyes." "What do you mean, wrong?" "They're white. No pupils, no color, just white." Silence on the radio for several seconds. Then, "Jake, I'm looking at Mrs. Kowalski right now. She's standing in my office, and her eyes are perfectly normal." I looked down at the figure in the potato field. It was still there, still motionless, still staring upward. But now there were others. More figures emerging from the irrigation ditches and walking between the rows. Men, women, children, all wearing the faces of people I'd never met, all with those same blank white eyes. "Dwight, how many Mrs. Kowalskis are there supposed to be?" "What kind of question is that?" "One, obviously." I counted the figures below me. 7 now, all identical, all wearing the same faded house dress, all staring at my plane with those empty white eyes. I'm seeing 7 of her down here, and more are appearing. The radio went quiet. When Dwight's voice returned, it sounded strained. "Jake, listen to me very carefully. Do not land. Do not attempt to help any of those figures. Complete your spray run at maximum altitude and return to base immediately. But if the real Mrs. Kowalski is in your office..." "She's not anymore," Rita's voice cut in. "Jake, she just walked out of the office and disappeared. Literally disappeared. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone." I looked down at the potato field. The 7 figures had arranged themselves in a perfect circle, arms raised toward my aircraft. As I watched, more figures emerged from the ground itself, not climbing out of holes or ditches, but simply materializing from the dark soil like plants growing in fast motion. Men in overalls, women in sundresses, children in school clothes, all with white eyes, all staring upward. Within minutes, there were dozens of them scattered across the potato field. "Dwight, they're multiplying. There must be 50 of them now. Just do the job, Jake. Spray the field and get out of there. I can't spray with all those people down there." "They're not people." Caleb's voice broke in. "Jake, those are the missing. Everyone who's disappeared around here over the past 20 years. They're wearing their faces, but they're not human." I climbed higher, studying the figures below. Now that Caleb mentioned it, I could see the differences. Some wore clothes that were decades out of style. Others had wounds that should have been fatal. Missing limbs, gaping holes in their chests, heads twisted at impossible angles. And they were all pointing at me now, their arms moving in perfect synchronization. "This is the second test," Dwight said over the radio. "They want to see if you'll follow orders, even when it looks like you'll be hurting innocent people." What happens if I don't spray? Then you fail the test, and they'll know you can be manipulated through guilt and fear. I made my decision. Banking into position for a spray run, I descended to optimal altitude and engaged the application system. The fungicide began flowing from the spray nozzles in a fine mist. The figures below didn't move as the chemicals settled over them. They just stood there, arms raised, white eyes tracking my flight path. The fungicide should have sent them running, should have at least made them flinch. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, their forms becoming more solid and defined. Halfway through the first pass, something changed. The figures began to shift and blur, their borrowed faces melting away like wax. What remained was worse than I could have imagined. They were tall and impossibly thin, with skin that looked like dried corn husks. Their arms were too long, ending in fingers that branched like roots. And their faces, if they could be called faces, were just smooth expanses of yellow-brown skin with those horrible white eyes. But it was their mouths that made me nearly lose control of the aircraft. When they opened them to speak, corn kernels spilled out instead of words, hundreds of kernels falling from their lips like bloody teeth. "Jake Hoffman," they said in unison, their voices carrying impossible distances through the air. "Come down to us, Jake Hoffman." I completed the spray run and banked away, but they followed my movement with their heads, all turning in perfect synchronization. "Tommy Svoboda tried to run," they called out. "Danny Krejci tried to hide. Maria Santos tried to understand. All of them learned the same lesson." What lesson? I found myself asking, though I hadn't keyed the radio. That the corn remembers everything. The figures began to sink back into the earth, but not before I saw what they were really doing. They weren't disappearing. They were planting themselves, burrowing into the soil like seeds. In moments, new corn stalks began sprouting from the spots where they'd stood, growing at an accelerated pace. Within minutes, the potato field had been transformed into a cornfield. Perfect rows of tall, healthy corn where there had been diseased potatoes moments before. My radio crackled with Dwight's voice. "Jake, get back here now. We've got company at the airstrip." I turned toward home, my hands shaking on the controls. Below me, the Nebraska landscape looked normal again. Farms and fields stretching to every horizon. No sign of the supernatural horror I'd just witnessed, but as I approached the airstrip, I could see what Dwight meant by company. The parking area was full of vehicles, pickup trucks, farm equipment, even a few cars I didn't recognize, and people were standing around the hangar, maybe 30 or 40 of them. I radioed for landing clearance, but got no response. As I circled the field, I could see more clearly what was waiting for me. The crowd around the hangar wasn't moving much, just standing in loose groups, like they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I set up for my landing approach, but something made me hesitate. The people below were too still, too quiet. Real crowds move and gesture and talk among themselves. This group just stood there, all facing the runway, all watching my aircraft, and they were all wearing the same expression, blank faces with white eyes. "Jake, do not land at the strip." A new voice came over the radio. It was Caleb, but he sounded like he was whispering. "They got here about 10 minutes ago. Just showed up in trucks and started waiting. Uncle Dwight tried to talk to them, but what? They all have his face now. All of them. 30 people, all wearing Uncle Dwight's face." I pulled up and began circling at a higher altitude. Sure enough, I could see that every person in the crowd below had the same features. Dwight's weathered face copied onto different bodies, like masks being worn by actors. "Where are the real Dwight and Rita?" "We're hiding in the office," Rita's voice answered. Jake, whatever you do, don't land. This is the setup for the third test. What's the third test? Coming home, Caleb said. They want to see if you'll trust your friends and colleagues, or if you'll recognize when they've been replaced. I looked down at the crowd of false Dwights. As I watched, they began moving in unison, walking toward the runway and arranging themselves in two lines, like they were preparing for a formal reception. So what do? I've got maybe an hour of fuel left. There's an emergency strip about 20 miles south, Rita said. Old World War II training field. It's not on any charts, but it's still usable. How do I find it? Follow the railroad tracks south from Gibbon until you see an abandoned grain elevator. The strip is about a mile east of there, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. I banked away from the airstrip, leaving the crowd of imposters behind. Below me, the railroad tracks gleamed in the afternoon sun, stretching south across the prairie like a silver thread. But as I followed them, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what they wanted me to do. The third test wasn't about choosing between real and fake colleagues. It was about running away when things got too dangerous. And something told me that Tommy Svoboda had made the same choice. I found the abandoned airstrip exactly where Rita said it would be, hidden among cottonwoods that formed a natural hangar. The runway was cracked and overgrown, but still long enough for a safe landing. I set the Cessna down as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky the color of dried corn silk. The silence felt different here. Not the comfortable quiet of rural Nebraska, but something heavier, more watchful. I shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit, trying to decide what to do next. My phone had no signal. The radio picked up only static. I was alone with a quarter tank of fuel and growing darkness. That's when I saw the farmhouse. It stood about half a mile from the strip, barely visible through the trees. Warm light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney like a promise of safety. I grabbed my emergency kit and started walking. The house was older than most in the area, built from local limestone with a wraparound porch that had seen better decades. A wooden sign by the front gate read, Svoboda Farm, established. 1952. Tommy's family farm. I knocked on the front door, my knuckles echoing hollow against the wood. Footsteps approached from inside, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair. "You must be Jake," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I'm Linda Svoboda, Tommy's wife." The interior was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of pot roast and fresh bread. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece. Tommy as a young man, Tommy and Linda on their wedding day, Tommy with 2 small children I assumed were theirs. "Mrs. Svoboda, I thought you lived in town. I thought Tommy was dead?" She smiled sadly. "That's what everyone believes. It's safer that way." She led me to the kitchen, where a man sat at the table reading a newspaper. He looked up as we entered, and I saw Tommy Svoboda's face, but his eyes were clear and human, not the blank white orbs I'd seen on the scarecrow. "You passed the tests," he said, folding the paper. "All 3 of them. That puts you in a very small group." "I don't understand. The truck in the river. The note you left." "Staged," Linda explained, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. "Tommy had to disappear before they could replace him permanently. The only way to survive is to let everyone think you're gone." Tommy leaned forward, his expression serious. "Those things have been here longer than human memory. They can take our shapes, copy our voices, even access our memories. But they can't replace someone who's already officially dead. So what happens now?" "Now you have a choice," Linda said. You can try to go back to your old life, knowing they'll never stop hunting you. Or you can disappear like Tommy did, and help us protect other pilots who end up working for Dwight. There are others? Tommy nodded. Danny Krejci lives about 50 miles north of here. Maria Santos runs a small charter service out of Colorado under a different name. We stay in touch, compare notes, try to keep track of their activities. I sipped the coffee, my mind reeling. What about Dwight? Rita? Caleb? They're good people caught in a bad situation, Tommy said. The entities need pilots to test, to study, to eventually replace. Dwight provides them, and in return, they leave his family alone. He's not evil, Linda added quickly, just scared. When you've lived here as long as he has, you learn that some compromises are necessary for survival. Through the kitchen window, I could see my Cessna sitting on the abandoned runway. In the morning, someone would find it there. Empty fuel tanks, pilot's logbook left open on the seat, no sign of Jake Hoffman anywhere. The Given Telegraph would run a small story about a missing pilot, probably blown off course during a routine flight. The FAA would conduct a brief investigation, find no evidence of mechanical failure, and close the case as pilot error. And somewhere in Nebraska, crop dusters would continue to fly their routes, following rules they don't fully understand, serving masters who wear familiar faces, but dream alien dreams. Linda squeezed my shoulder. Welcome to the disappeared Jake. We've been waiting for you. Outside, the corn whispered secrets to the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, something that looked like me was probably climbing into a Cessna, ready to take my place in the world above. But down here, in the spaces between the official records and the comfortable lies people tell themselves, Tommy Svoboda and his fellow ghosts kept watch over the fields that were never meant for human eyes. The corn remembers everything. Even the people who learned how to forget themselves.